Just going to trust the software once again. My name is Eric. I am streaming pretty much every week about accessibility, although I do have a vacation coming up, so the next 2 weeks we will not be streaming about accessibility, but I do this every week. And why? Because my job is accessibility. I'm an accessibility specialist, as they call it. I am concerned with the web components that we make at ING. It's a large Dutch bank. These are the UI components that get reused within the entire organization. And I am responsible for the accessibility. I also am a auditor, a freelance auditor. So besides these little tiny components, I also look at the big websites and see if there's anything that can be improved. And I just like to share the experience of being an accessibility specialist, as they call it. So that's why we stream every week, to share not just the knowledge that's also in specifications, but also the experience of doing audits. And today we have with us Kate. And Kate has a presentation on how to fall in love with accessibility. So Kate, tell us all about it.
Hi, everyone. So this presentation is specifically for developers. I'm going to get really into the technical joys of accessibility. And I am a public servant. I've worked in government for many, many years. I spent 18 years I'm in Canada, so I was with what we call the provincial government, which would be the equivalent of a state government, for 18 years. And I'm currently with our federal government, with Canada Post, where we deliver the mail and we provide online mail and parcel shipping services. I've worked as a designer and a developer, and I'm currently a manager of a digital accessibility team. And I'm also a person with a disability. That's what the PWD on this slide stands for, short for person with disability. I was born with hearing loss in both of my ears. I wear hearing aids, and they're really tiny, so that makes my type of disability practically an invisible one. Most people don't realize that I have it. So if you hear me asking Eric to repeat himself, that's why. I do lip read quite a bit, and in situations like this where I can't, it's a little bit harder for me, but that's the reality of living with a disability. We have challenges. I have been self-employed as well in my career, and I've also worked in accessibility policy, which is very different than doing the technical digital part of accessibility. So it gave me a really good broad view of how government does policy for people with disabilities. So that's me.
And can you say anything about the size of your team or Canada Post? How many customers do you work for?
So all of Canada Post is quite big. We're about 60,000 people. A lot of those are people who deliver the mail and parcels. The actual digital team who does websites, which I'm a part of, and we do native mobile apps as well, is around 200 people. And then the accessibility team within that is brand new. We just put together the team at the beginning of 2020. The digital accessibility team is 3 people. There's also an accessibility policy team as well, which is also 3 people. So we've got a total of 6 people specifically dedicated to accessibility.
Which is actually a luxury.
It is. Yes, and to have a budget as well is quite progressive. I know it seems small when you think there's 60,000 people, but there are companies that are bigger that have less people.
Yeah, there are a lot of companies that don't even have people. So I think, you're in a good position for that part. I mean, it could always be more. Like, you probably feel understaffed at every point, but you've got people.
Yeah. And our goal is not to have a huge accessibility team. The goal is really to build everyone else's capacity for doing accessibility. So it's a bit of a benefit of having a small team that we can't do it all, and it forces all the other teams to take accountability for accessibility as well.
Because have you, what kind of roles are there in your team?
I'm going to talk about that a bit later in the presentation, actually, but I'll just sum it up as we have designers, developers, QA testers, and strategists, and people who manage and organize things, a whole bunch of roles for management type, project managers, product owners, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any questions yet, so take it away. I'm very curious.
Okay. So what we're going to cover in this talk I'm going to talk about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG for short, and I'm going to talk about why they're not your best place to start learning about accessibility. And I'm also going to say, because this talk is targeted towards developers, or as we would call them, techies, that the way to start with accessibility is using the technology, in this case, assistive devices. I'm going to cover 5 things you should care about in your code, talk about how accessibility is a team sport, so I'm going to go over all the different roles and how they can support accessibility. And then how to decide what to do in context, which is where people really tend to get lost with accessibility when they're new. Now, my definition, and everyone has, I guess, a slightly different definition of accessibility, but for me, it's really about creating usability for people with disabilities. And when we think about usability, it's just making things easy to use. So it's beyond having compliance with a set of guidelines. It actually has to be usable and user-friendly. Now, where I'm from, we have 1 in 4 in our province, or what you would call a state if you were an American, who has a disability. Of that, the vast majority are actually invisible disabilities like mine. We have a lot of people who suffer from mobility-related, pain-related, and mental health-related disabilities. But 1 in 4 is quite high. That's, 25% of people have some sort of limitation. And so accessibility is really important to us. We're actually one of the first provinces to put really solid accessibility legislation in place as well. And that's how I got into accessibility, actually, because the law for the government itself to make its own websites accessible was passed in 2001, so nearly 20 years ago. And I had to learn about it way back when it first came out, before there were lots and lots of resources out there. So it was quite challenging back then, because you don't have all the resources you have now, but it's still challenging in many ways, because there's a lot more information about accessibility, but it's not always the right information for beginners. So that's what this talk is about, really where to start. And the reason why is we need lots of people who know a little about accessibility and a few people who know a lot. So I'm one of those people who knows a lot. Eric is one of those people, and we need people who are experts in accessibility. But what we really need is all of our developers, all of our designers, writers, product owners to know a little bit about accessibility, so that we can all come together and start making the whole world of digital accessible. We can't leave it to those few people who are experts. There's just not enough of us in the world, and I don't think there ever will be.
And is this like a specific goal for your team, or a sort of mission? Is this something you keep in mind?
It's a personal goal of mine to share what I know and to try to empower other people to learn about accessibility. And then within my organization as well, it's very much about other people learning what they need to know, the specifics of what they need to know for their role, and when to do accessibility, so that it all falls into place and it doesn't fall on the shoulders of the accessibility team. So I'm going to get into my first section, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and why you don't want to start here. So what they are, if you don't know, they're an international standard for web accessibility. There are 78 success criteria, so 78 things you need to pass in order to be considered accessible. And there's 3 different levels of accessibility. There's level A, which is the most basic level, double A, which is what most people strive for, and then triple A, which is highly accessible. And we also have a new version of the guidelines coming soon. I hear it's going to come out this year, and there are going to be 9 more criteria. So that's quite a lot.
Yeah, and they're already up for review. So if anybody gets really enthusiastic from your talk, they can give some feedback, right?
Definitely, yeah. If you're completely new to accessibility, it's a lot to learn, and it's a lot to remember and to understand. So there's also the challenge. I've taken this paragraph directly from the current standard, and it's quite challenging to read them. So I'm just going to read this out for anyone who can't see. The Web Content Accessibility Guideline 2.1 success criteria are written as testable statements that are not technology specific. So what that really means is you have to be able to test against the guidelines, and it can't be specific to a particular technology. So they have to be very general, which actually makes them harder to understand. And guidance about satisfying the success criteria in specific technologies, as well as general information about interpreting the success criteria, is provided in a separate document. So it's not actually just one set of guidelines, it's the guidelines and two supporting documents, one on how to actually apply it in a specific technology and one about how to understand what the guidelines are telling you. So that's another reason I don't suggest people start there, because the volume of information is overwhelming and the readability isn't great. Now, the standards are really, really important documents, so I'm not trying to be critical of them. They really are important. It's just not a good learning tool. That's the point I'm trying to drive through here.
Yeah, I have somebody in the chat saying that I've read through the new criteria. To me, they seem to make sense. I think they always make sense, but it's also very, very complicated to write them because they are like the law. They should they should cover every loophole and every shortcoming should be covered. I mean, it's pretty much as complicated as you can get it, I guess. Have you looked into the new criteria also, or what's your impression?
I think the materials are a really good reference point. So I'm very familiar with them, and I'm sure you are too, and anyone who works in the field specifically. But when I think of all my, 200 people in digital, and should they be highly familiar with all of the guidelines, that's where I think is the challenge. And when I started my career, we were worried about legal compliance because we were part of the government and we had to meet the law. So we had to be very familiar with the guidelines because that was what was written in the law, compliance with those guidelines. But as I evolved in my career and as I started, trying to teach other people about accessibility, that's the feedback that I got, that they were too complicated, it was overwhelming, and it wasn't a good starting point. So even though it's where I started and I didn't really have, well, I wouldn't say I didn't have trouble understanding them. I had to read them and reread them and reread them and, work with them and apply them. And then now I'm very comfortable with them and familiar with them. But having that feedback from people who are beginners really shaped my perspective as to how to go about teaching people about accessibility.
Yeah, I'm trying to imagine how it is. Like, it would be you receiving a tourist and saying, "Hi, welcome to Canada. Here is the law book. Good luck."
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do that, and I feel terrible because it's all that I knew how.
Yeah.
So
what are you gonna tell us instead?
What I'm going to say is people should start with assistive technology instead and start by learning by doing instead of by reading. And I'm going to use this example of learning to ride a bike. So when you want to learn to ride a bike, you don't pull out the Cycling for Dummies manual. You get on the bike and you go and you practice. And I'm going to suggest that the same approach is the best way to start with accessibility if you're brand new.
It's like you've made this presentation for Dutch people like me, putting in the biking and everything. Yeah.
Yeah. I know you love your bikes. I love them too, and I love Dutch people in Holland, and one of my favorite places in the world to visit. I just have to say that since you brought it up.
Well, next time we have to go biking then, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to focus on 3 different types of assistive technologies because these are the 3 that is easiest to get started with. There's certainly more as people get further along in their accessibility journey that they can explore. But for now, I'm going to talk about keyboard. Everybody has a keyboard. If you have a computer, you have a keyboard, right? You can't use it without one. Screen readers are really easy to get. They're free. If you have a Mac, they're already built in. If you have Windows, you can get one, and I'll talk about where. And then magnifiers are built in to both Mac and Windows computers by default. So that's why these 3 are good starting points because it's really easy access. So when I talk about keyboard testing, what that really means and what I think every developer should start with is whatever you build, test it with the keyboard. So that means don't touch your mouse, don't touch your trackpad, just go through with the keyboard. And I think that's fairly intuitive. A lot of developers are really into command line and coding, and they're comfortable with the keyboard. So I don't think it's a stretch to ask them to do that. So what you really want to be looking at is, can you access interactive elements with the tab key? You should be able to tab forward through anything interactive and shift tab to go backwards. So interactive things are links, buttons, form fields. And as you're doing that, you want to be able to see the focus. So I've drawn a little blue ring around the word focus here. That's the default for most computers. When you're focused on a link or a button or something, it'll usually draw a blue circle. It might be a different color, or if you've changed your operating settings, or if the developer of the website changed the focus styles. But that's the default.
I think if you have ever used the keyboard to focus, then this is instantly recognizable. So that's really good. Yeah.
Yeah. And you want to go through the whole page and hopefully an entire journey throughout the site and several pages. And you want to make sure that the tab order makes sense. So if you're seeing something that's a 2-column layout on screen, you want the tab order to go through the left column and the right column, assuming you're left to right English writing, backwards if you were right to left, the different languages. And you want to make
Which
sure
isn't actually backwards, but yeah.
Yeah, not for them, for us.
Yeah.
Not for them. You want to make sure you don't get stuck anywhere, because sometimes people will be able to tab into something but not get back out of it again. That happens sometimes in a modal, or it might be a little iframe embedded that there's just no way to exit it. And then, the only way somebody can continue is they actually have to reload the whole site, start all over again.
And the funny thing for me with all of these, smashing my microphone, very smart. The funny thing for me with all of these is the more complicated your page gets, the more issues you will see here. Because the most basic default page will probably do fine with all these things.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, if you're writing just plain HTML, it's accessible by default. It's all the things that we add to it, all the stuff that is part of modern web design and development that really breaks accessibility, which is why, we should take responsibility for not doing that, because you're taking something that works out of the box and you're not intentionally, but you are breaking it. So the second thing, and I've got links in this presentation when you see the green with the underlining, but I've got the URLs written out at the end. So you can find everything that I've got linked here just by writing down my GitHub URL at the end. So screen reader testing is about using software that reads aloud what's on the screen. So it's often used by people who are blind, they can't see, so they listen to websites, but it's also used by people who have dyslexia, they have trouble reading, and so they prefer to listen. And there might be people with other disabilities who can see, but they still prefer to listen. And so we have two different types of screen readers, Windows and Mac. You don't usually find, I don't think there are any that work cross-platform really well. So it's one or the other.
There's a Linux screen reader if you really want to. I would not advise it because it doesn't really work well with modern technology on the web, but it's better than nothing, I guess.
Yeah. All of the most popular ones are either Windows, so JAWS is one of the top ones for Windows. It is not free, so
Nope.
Maybe not a good starting.
Very not free.
Very not free, yeah, so the opposite of free. The free one, it's not free per se. It is free, but you can donate if you want to donate, and I do encourage people to donate what they can. Is called NVDA, and that one it works really well with Firefox browser on Windows. And then if you have a MacBook, you have a built-in screen reader called VoiceOver. So you're just going to have to find it in your accessibility setting. And so in my GitHub repository, I have a page on learning. I have pages on learning about accessibility and learning to use testing tools. So I've got links to the free screen readers and instructions on how to run them on your computer and what commands to use to make them work. So I won't go too much into that. I encourage people to go to my GitHub repo or just even Google screen reader and you'll find it.
Yeah.
You're going to find some information and try it out.
Yeah, I personally also like the DQ, which is a rather large accessibility consulting company. They have a page with all the shortcuts that you can use in each screen reader, and I think they're really manageable. Like it's a clear overview, and it gives you a nice starting point.
Yeah, and I mean, I encourage people. You don't have to be an expert screen reader user. You just have to be able to, get through a page from top to bottom, right? Interact with form fields and move your way through links and move your way through text. You don't need to know every single shortcut um, on how to use them.
Yeah, completely agree. Because screen readers can be entirely overwhelming. And if you ever see somebody use it, or mostly hear somebody use it, it's very overwhelming. But you do not have to know the ins and the outs. If you can tap through a page, you're really far ahead already. Yeah.
Yeah. I've actually got a demo at the end of this of somebody running their screen readers so people can listen to that.
Perfect.
So what you're really checking with a screen reader is you want to make sure that what you're hearing is matching what you see so that you're getting that equivalent experience. So whatever somebody who can see on the site is seeing, you're hearing as well. And you want to make sure that any images and icons are described, first off, described at all, and then second off, described accurately. Because if you haven't described them, what you're going to hear is image file names, and that is not pleasant. It's just not useful at all. And then the third thing is when you're interacting with elements, so these are things like links, form field, button, menus, accordion, tab, modals, anything that you would normally interact with a mouse. But when you're using a screen reader, I mean, if you're using a screen reader and you're just using it to test, I would still recommend you stick to the keyboard only because that's closer to the experience of somebody who is using a screen reader who's blind. If you want to be really lazy about it and you're just getting started, by all means use the mouse and listen, but you're not going to catch everything unless you've already done your keyboard testing separately.
Yeah, it's like you're doing 2-in-1 basically, right?
Mm-hmm. You want to make sure when you're interacting with elements, you would understand what's happening if you couldn't see. That doesn't necessarily tell you how to fix it or what should be done, but the first part of understanding accessibility is finding those barriers for people with disabilities. And then once you've got a good grasp of that, you can start learning how to fix those barriers. Everybody's got to start somewhere, right?
Yeah, and I think it's also tough that sometimes, let's say you have an accessibility consultant or whatever, the only issues that you can actually tackle are also the ones that you can test yourself. I mean, if you cannot test it, then it's really hard to fix it.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the nice things we do at Canada Post is we test with people with disabilities. So we have access to expertise that we don't personally have. There's a big difference with somebody who uses the technology all day, every day, and then even somebody, like you or me who uses it as part of our job, but we're not dependent on it. And I'm certainly not using a screen reader when I'm not working, when I'm just browsing the web. I'm just using it to test. And so it's a different perspective from those people who are using it and depend on it, right?
Yeah.
So last thing to test with is screen magnifier. And what a magnifier does is it blows things up really big. And it's kind of like Zoom on your browser, but it's not quite the same because it's magnifying your entire operating system. And so it's not changing the layout in any way, no matter how much you zoom in. And I recommend people zoom in about 400% at least. And again, in my GitHub repo, I have instructions on if you're using a Mac or a PC, where to find your magnifier, how to turn it on. There's also magnifiers and screen readers on mobile devices. I'm going to focus a bit more on desktop, but just wanted to share that you can do all of this also on a mobile phone. And sometimes people with disability do use a keyboard plugged into their mobile phone. So keyboard testing on a phone with an external keyboard is a real thing that you can do.
Yeah, and the thing
So,
is, you can zoom and magnify on mobile, but the thing is, you
mhm,
can only zoom when they let you, and that's a bit of an issue
that's true.
sometimes.
Yeah, very good point. A lot of people turn off the magnification or the zoom on a website, which is, I don't think they realize that they're stopping people who need to magnify from using their site. You might be worried about the layout and how things reflow if people magnify, but that's really not as important as people being able to use it at all. And people who have low vision, they're not completely blind, but their eyesight isn't great. They really do need that magnification to use your site.
Yeah, it's
And
the big
so,
difference between people like, can you use the website at all, or does it look really good?
yeah,
I mean, what do you want? Yeah.
yeah. And I mean, a lot of people worry about things like what does the focus look like and what does it look like if people magnify a lot? And oh, it doesn't look good, let's turn that off. But the only people doing that are the people who need it, you know? So maybe you shouldn't worry about what it looks like for, you know, if worrying about what it looks like stops you from giving people access to use it at all.
Yeah, and I think it's our experience is very comparable because I work at a bank, you work at a post company, post company basically. Um, if people want to use your service, it's not like they have many options. So at least have the possibility to be able to use your service. That's the most important thing that you can offer.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's about human rights, right? So when it comes to magnifiers, we're talking people low vision who have to zoom in to see. Um, and contrast is important too, but I don't talk about color contrast so much because um, I feel like that's the responsibility of the designer less so than the developer. So that's why I'm going to focus really throughout this presentation on what developers should be worrying about. That also keeps it simpler for people who are brand new. So you want to make sure that you can, when you interact with something, can you see the changes that you would see without magnification? So modals are a big one here. If you trigger a modal when you're magnified, does that modal pop up in your viewport, or is it like way off the screen and people wouldn't even know that a modal had opened? Except for maybe the fact that the screen might have an overlay now and everything is dim. Will they be able to find that modal?
What I
Or we see
really
this
like
often.
as a good bad example, it's not always easy to find good bad examples. But it's like these calculator forms where you put in all these numbers and then somewhere else on the screen something changes, but you have no idea. And when you are zoomed in, that's even harder to see.
Yeah. I mean, the most common thing we see is error messages. So if you're triggering an error message and it's somewhere else on the form, let's say you're way at the bottom of the form and you hit submit and the error is way at the top of the form, you know, how are people going to know it's up there unless you scroll them, or you have some sort of notification. Um, so you can do a number of things. You can move the focus up to where that error is, or put a message down near the submit button that says there's an error on this form, and hopefully you can even link back to the top of the form or link directly to the field with the error in it. So that's another thing you want to check with a magnifier. And once you start doing testing over and over and you get a good sense of accessibility, you know when you need to open a magnifier and when you don't. It's not something you need to do on every single page. So if I was looking at a content page and it was just plain content and there's no interaction, I probably wouldn't add on magnifier testing. But I would have the company that we use for testing with people with disabilities. I would have someone go through it there, but I wouldn't necessarily test it myself before we even send it to them for testing.
You get like this sixth
So,
sense of detecting really badly designed pages.
well, you know, you get used to it if you start doing testing, and I think that's why the hands-on testing is really helpful because um, when you start to see how the assistive technology works and where the barriers are, you have a sense for when things are going to go wrong in a way that you don't if you just focus on the guidelines and auditing to the guidelines. It's a lot harder to catch some of these types of things. So now we're going to jump into talking about code. These are the 5 things that I think are most important because I see them happening a lot. I see developers doing these 5 things, and I know it can make a big difference. So there's many more things you can worry about when it comes to coding and making your code accessible. But again, we're talking about beginners, and you got to start small and build your way up. So the first thing, structure. And of the structure, I would say headings are probably the thing I would say are the most important. We have people using screen readers who want to know what all the headings on the page are so they can get a sense of the structure of the page. So first off, you want to use headings properly. I've done an example of what you see people doing sometimes. They'll take a paragraph and they will just make the font size big and bold. That's not actually a heading. A heading is an H1 or an H2 or an H3 or any of those. And the other thing we see people doing is changing the order of headings. They'll go H1 to H3 because they want a smaller heading. But you know what? That's what CSS is for. If you're going to make a heading smaller, just put some styles on it, right? Don't jump levels. For the most part. I mean, there might be the odd case where there's an exception where it makes sense, but if you're new, you don't know enough about the rules to break the rules, so follow the rules. Is what I would say.
And I
So
often compare it to reading a newspaper. I mean, if you're visually abled and you're reading a newspaper, you're also going from heading to heading to heading. And that's often what screen reader users do as well. If you use a screen reader, you're probably also going to look for the headings and determine your structure. And it's the same hierarchy that really helps you understand what it's all about. If it's there, of course.
Yeah. And I focus on headings more than other ways of understanding structure because they benefit everyone. So if you're a screen reader user, you hear the headings. If you're low vision, you see the headings. If you have cognitive issues, the headings help you understand the content. There are other things you can do structurally, like landmarks that designate certain areas of a site for certain types of content, but they don't have as broad of an application for people with disabilities, and headings really benefits everyone. So that's why I say, here's the one you start with, headings.
Yeah, and I always use, not always, sometimes I use like these readability tools. So they read your page and they present them in a new way that's really, really easy to read. They also make use of these kind of semantics. They also want to know if there are headings on the page. So yeah, I get benefits out of it apart from the standard accessibility tools as well.
Mm-hmm. The second is semantics. And again, there's many things we could say about semantics. Use all the HTML elements appropriately. They all have meaning. P stands for paragraph. It's just not a random letter. LI is a list. These things have meaning. But I think the one I see a lot is links and buttons, people mixing those up. You can have a link that looks like a button visually, but from a screen reader perspective, it still needs to read as a link, and vice versa. If you use a link to make a button, you better put some code on there so that it reads out as a button. And the difference really is if it goes somewhere, so it's going to a new page or an anchor link somewhere else on the page, it's a link. If it does something, it changes the state of an object or it submits a form, it should say button. And so we can style links. I have an example here of an A tag with class button, and so all the styling makes that link look like a button. But if it's linking to something, it has an href and it's going somewhere, it's still a link, regardless of how you style it. And then if it's a button, you can use the actual button tag. Or we see this all the time. People want to turn divs into buttons. But if you're going to do that, then make sure it has a role of button and it has a tab index of 0 so that it's actually tabbable, and then you have an event listener for a spacebar and an enter key. So if you use the button tag, it does all of this stuff for you already by default. So definitely if you can use a button, use a button. But if you're going to use a div and pretend that it's a button, you have to make sure you're doing all of those steps. It has to be, keyboard accessible, and it has to read out as a button to a screen reader.
And in what way could this benefit a user, or could it go wrong if you don't do it right?
Well, there's expectations, right? When we talk about semantics, because you're telling somebody who's using a screen reader, and I focus a lot on screen reader users, even though they're a very small proportion of the people with disabilities who we're designing for. They are the ones who probably have the most difficulty if we don't provide accessible sites. So without some minimum accessibility, they can't use it at all. Whereas people who have low vision, they can usually figure things out. So I do a lot of emphasis on screen reader users. And because you can't see what's on the page, you have to have an understanding of what everything does. Otherwise, it messes with your mental model, because if something reads out as a link, you expect it to go somewhere. If it doesn't go somewhere and you're still on the same page and you don't know what the heck happened, what did that thing actually do? You can't see. So let's say, this link opened up a modal and that modal wasn't properly coded, so that you don't even know. You click something, you thought you were going to a new page, and now you're confused and you're lost and you're not sure what to do next. So that's why it's so important.
Yeah, and I really like your example of spacebar and enter as well on the button key. Or if you have a button element, you can use a spacebar and enter key. That's better said. Because when you have a link and you press the spacebar, you actually scroll down a page. So there's something completely different that happens, unlike with a button. So sometimes it feels really nitpicky. Like I'm an accessibility person, use links and buttons and organize it. But when you do actually notice the difference, it can be so annoying. And there are so many things that are different, but it's just a big list of small things.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why it's always better just to use HTML the way it's meant to be used. And it's annoying to see all of these new frameworks where everything's in a div and a span, and they're not using proper semantics, because then you have to add so much more to the code to make it work properly.
It's actually more work, again, so why would you? Yeah.
HTML is accessible by default. So again, it's another example of how people break accessibility. Tab order. So that's another thing, especially if you're creating some sort of sequential process, like a checkout. Your tab sequence should match what you would expect someone to do with a mouse. So if it's like a step-by-step process, or you're going from top to bottom, or like if you had a column and then another column on the right, and then you go back to the left column and back to the right column, like if that was the order of your interaction, you would want your tab order to be the same. And two things that people don't really understand well are tab index 0 versus -1. First off, you should never use positive numbers in tab index. I'll just say that, because then you're changing the tab order and you're overriding it, and you don't want to do that. What tab index 0 does is it makes something focusable. So that example that I had on the last slide of a div being used as a button, if we put tab index 0, now it's focusable by the keyboard. And you never want to use tab index 0 on headings or other text. Sometimes I see people go overboard and they're trying to make something more accessible, and they're like, okay, we'll put tab index 0 on all of our headings, or we'll put it on all the paragraphs, and suddenly everything on the page is tabbable, and that's not good either. You only want to use things appropriately. So if it's not supposed to be clickable with the mouse, it shouldn't be focusable. And then sometimes you do need to use tab index because you want to programmatically jump the focus. So let's say you're using some sort of Angular framework and you want to move the focus, and so you can't use a regular anchor link. So you set tab index on something, and then you're going to use JavaScript to jump, like you're going to do a modal.button.focus. So you need your tab index on that heading, but you don't want it to be 0 because you don't want it to be focusable by the keyboard, so you use a -1. -1 makes it programmatically focusable, so you can move the focus to it, but you can't tab to it. So it's still not in the tab order, especially if it's a heading. It shouldn't be in the tab order, but you want to be able to move the focus visually to that heading, programmatically, I should say. that make sense?
It does to me, but then again, I've heard it before, so that doesn't really help, does it? I
Okay.
think a modal is like one of the best examples because in general you don't want to touch the focus of a user. Like let users control their focus. It's like grabbing somebody's mouse cursor and dragging it all around. You don't want to touch it. If somebody wants to focus something, they'll focus it. And one of the exceptions for me is, and a really good example is a modal. So when you click a button, a user will expect the focus to be on the modal, and the only way to put it there is to put it programmatically. So put in a piece of code, to put the focus on the modal, and you need
Yeah.
tab index -1 for that. It doesn't work otherwise.
Yeah. You can also put, focus on things that actually already are focusable, like a button. So sometimes you might put the focus around the entire modal, or on the heading of the modal, or on the first input field in the modal, or if there's a button. But it's all very. This is where we get to the end, where it's like, how do you make decisions, like where exactly to put the focus? So I'll talk about that a bit later. There is, despite having so many accessibility guidelines, there still is a lot of decision making involved. So you want to make sure, we just talked about this, when you're moving the focus visually, like you're opening a modal, you want to make sure you move it programmatically. It also applies to tabs and accordions. If you're calculating something, if you're sorting or filtering, although it's debatable. One of the things, I'm always debating over is when you've got a search and you do a filter on the search, do you leave them where they are and let them finish filtering and then find their way to the search results, or do you assume that once they've filtered something, they want to go right to the search results? That's why I have in brackets debatable.
Everything is
These are the things.
debatable when it's about accessibility, right? I
Yeah,
think the most important thing is at least let the user know what's going to happen.
yeah, yeah. Carousels are another one. If you've got like a next previous and a carousel, obviously carousels aren't great. I think everyone who works in the web hates carousels, and our clients love them. Uh, but sometimes we have to use them. So you want to make sure, if you've got a carousel of images and people are hitting the next button, that the focus is moving, or that they can find, the next set of images in the carousel, even if you don't move the focus. Form errors are another one where you might want to change the focus. Again, debatable. Two things to remember is always trap the the focus inside a modal, and allow people to close a modal with the escape key. Um, that's one of the most common mistakes on the web. A modal opens and the keyboard user or the screen reader user is still stuck on the page behind.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
their focus has they
yeah.
are not in the modal.
It's one of those things, right? The whole idea of a modal, at least as how I understand it, is that you get a new context. It's like you're on a separate page. Whatever happens in a modal stays in a modal. It's like a digital Las Vegas. I don't know how to better describe it, but that also means that you have to keep your focus on the modal and that you should not be able to interact with the background in any way. And if you have a screen reader or you are using a keyboard, something that not everybody uses, it's really easy to interact with the background anyway. You can often circumvent things that the programmers think of because they do not think about screen readers or keyboards. So yeah, modal is like a new context. That's how I see it mostly.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you. And then you've said this already, only change the focus if the user has triggered some sort of action. So that's where I think it sometimes makes sense if someone submits the form and there's an error, to move the focus because they've done something that has triggered the moving of the focus. Or if they clicked a button and opened a modal, you've triggered that. So you can definitely move the focus there. You don't want to get to a point where you're scared to move the focus, because sometimes you have to. So notifications, I think this is the last of my 5 things to go through that are really important. When you change something on a page, you have to notify people who can't see that it's changed. So again, opening a modal, if there's an error on a form submit, you might move the focus, but the other thing you might do, which is arguably probably the better thing to do, is just announce the error. And again, on my GitHub, I have lots more details on how to do this. I'll talk about briefly the two approaches. You can use an ARIA Live polite, and if you put that attribute on a div or a paragraph or something, it'll announce changes to the content inside it. So let's say you have an empty div, and then someone submits the form, and the error message is injected into that div. If you have an ARIA Live polite, screen reader will read aloud that content that has been injected. And Roll Alert does very much the same thing. Roll Alert is just a little more strong because it'll announce things immediately. So if it's a time-sensitive message versus ARIA Live polite will wait until, if something was already happening in the background, it won't interrupt. That's why it's called polite. It doesn't interrupt. Versus Alert does.
Yeah, I was very happy to discover that one day. There's polite and there's assertive. Those are both options that you can pick. And like 9 out of 10 times you need polite. But there has actually been a suggestion to also have the option to make it rude. And I think that sounds... I would never use it, but it sounds like a great option to have.
It does, yeah. Roll Alert is kind of the rude option right there.
Yeah, I think that's assertive, comparable to assertive even. So rude would be, I don't know. Yeah. Would be even worse.
Yeah, assertive and Roll Alert are pretty much identical. All right, so my next section is on accessibility as a team sport. So this talk is really targeted towards developers, but if you know what all the other people on your team, hopefully you have a team. If you're, one of those freelancers who does everything all by yourself, you have to play every role.
Yeah.
But most of us now work on teams where we have designers and content writers and project managers, and so everybody has a role to play. So it's really even the client, like the client has to accept accessibility. Otherwise, you'll have challenges getting funding to do the work, or they'll, want to do a dynamically rotating carousel or something like that. So even they have a role to play. Your project manager has to account for it in timelines. I'm going to go through all of these at a very high level on the next slide, but just to show you that, here are all the different roles, and there might even be more of them, but it's not just up to the developer or even the accessibility specialist. Everybody has a part to play.
And I do really like it when people take their responsibility. So if there's like this developer that says, "Hey, contrast is a good. Let's talk to UX." That's really enjoyable to work with these kind of people.
Yeah, and it works. Accessibility becomes really a lot more effortless when everybody's working together, and everyone on the team cares about it and wants to do their part. And then when you try to put accessibility on one person and have them do all of it, that's when it becomes a bit challenging, and it almost starts to feel like a burden because, why should the developer be responsible for the accessibility of the design or QA testing, or, that's not their role. They're the developer. They're responsible for the code. So
at least I hope they are. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're not, then what are they doing? So your product owner should be discussing accessibility with your stakeholders or clients, whatever you call them, hopefully during your sprint reviews. If you're using Agile, it's something you should actually talk about. And if you have an accessibility team, they should be telling them when they're making changes to the product so that the accessibility team can be aware and help out as needed. You want your project managers to include accessibility in your work estimates during sprint planning and share planned release dates with the accessibility team and others, hopefully during sprint reviews as well, so everyone knows when a change is coming. UX researchers should be including people with disabilities in their research and testing. Your visual designers or graphic designers, whatever you call them, maybe they're also your UX designers who do the visuals, should be checking color contrast, should be using readable fonts at large sizes, and choosing diverse images. That goes a bit beyond accessibility. That's not one of the accessibility guidelines, but if you're going to be accessible, you want to represent diversity as well in how you portray people on your website. And then content designers should be checking the reading level. You want everything to be, I think in most organizations, a grade 8 level or lower is usually acceptable. It's kind of like trying to achieve AA accessibility for reading level, even though that's not, again, part of the guidelines specifically. That's my recommendation. And you would have logical page titles and descriptive link text. And make sure you describe either the content or function of images. And people sort of mix these up a bit sometimes. If an image is a link, you're really describing not what it looks like, but what it does or where it goes. So a good example to visualize is an icon of a house that links to the home page. So house is not the best description for that. It's home because it links to home or home page. Or like printer icon. You don't want to say this is a printer, it's print. Those examples are really simple, so it's easy to figure out. But imagine you had a link to terms and conditions, and it was a picture of a piece of paper with writing on it. You don't want to say piece of paper with writing on it. You want to say terms and conditions. So
Yeah, and
people can figure out where that's going.
it's usually with icons and pictograms and stuff like that, right? So you have like this button that does something, and you don't want to hear arrow pointing to the left. You want to know that it's back or page back or whatever.
Yeah, like the gear icon. You don't care that it's a gear, it's for settings. So that's the important description there.
Yeah, it's not like you're opening a page and you're going to say, hey, where are my gears at? It's not very important.
Exactly. So product designers, if you're doing a design mockup, you should indicate the tab order. So developers know where you expect the user to, flow through, not just visually, but in tab order as well. I suggest also that they provide screen reader experience notes on the design. Maybe that's a bit advanced for most people, but that's where we want them to go. Because imagine as a developer, if you're getting a design handoff and it already tells you the tab order and it's got little notes for screen readers and reminds you to move the focus here when you click on this. And that's how we really get this done, by building it into everyone's work. If you have a design system and there are accessible patterns in it, you want to use those. And I also suggest designers check when they're doing their testing after the developer has built something, they're checking it over and making sure it meets their requirements for design. Also check using Wave, which is an automated testing tool. And it's a visual one, so it's a nice one for designers to use. For developers, you want to use semantic HTML with accessibility in mind. You want to manage your focus and your notifications. You want to also use your design system. If it already has accessible code components, just use that. And then check your code. That's the really critical one here. Developers, check your code. It doesn't matter what tool you use. I like Axe, and that's the one I recommend to my developers. But any automated accessibility testing tool. Because the time when you're writing your code is the time you want to find your accessibility problem. You don't want to wait until you're already done and it's being pushed to stage and you're pre-production and QA is testing it. By the time you catch your accessibility errors there, it's so far done. You might have gone and built 10 other different pages and things that you don't want to have to go back and go to that one page and go and figure out what you did and how to fix it. And the other thing that happens is you build a little component and you decide to use it throughout the whole application. And now you've got, instead of like, if you would have caught that accessibility issue right at the beginning, you wouldn't have had it proliferate throughout your entire site. When it comes to QA testers, you want to check key tasks using assistive technology. So this is where I think the keyboard, the screen reader, and the screen magnifier really fits in. And I don't say that you can't do this type of testing earlier, but I do think it's really important that when you've got something built well enough that you've got an entire user journey that you can go through that journey at least once using each of these types of tools. And then lastly, you've got your accessibility subject matter expert. And what they're really responsible for is creating internal accessibility standards, providing guidance on training, testing, and ongoing improvement. So it's really, I think, up to everyone on the team to do something, but we don't leave it all for the accessibility team. You can see how much of it is being distributed. And when we do it like this, it works really well.
Yeah, and it looks like in a perfect situation, the accessibility person does not get involved with the product directly, I guess.
Yeah, the way we do it at Canada Post is we have our accessibility experts act as coaches and guides. They help a variety of Scrum teams with their work, but they don't do the work for them. That's the important thing, because you don't want your accessibility team to become a bottleneck. They're there to support everyone else. So I got a few tips here on using Axe, since it is one of my favorite tools for developers. You open Axe once you've got it installed. It's a free extension. You can get it for I think it's definitely Chrome, and I think it might also be available on Safari and Firefox. I know it's Firefox and Chrome for sure. I'm not sure if it's available on Safari.
I also use Axe every now and then, and it's basically available where you need it, I guess, because it's an open source JavaScript library, which means you can use it in your testing or in your build or whatever you like it inside of your company. And I've used it as an extension both in Chrome and Firefox.
Yeah. What's your favorite testing tool, by the way?
Can I say that I am my own favorite testing tool?
Okay, sure, yeah. Definitely.
No, I definitely use Axe a lot because I really like that it gives no false positives. I think that's a really good promise. So every time it tells you there is an issue, there is actually an issue and not just something you have to check. But most of the things that I do is just inspecting the code and checking the code and going through all of the code because that's where the issues are and that's where you have to find them, I guess.
Yeah. What I really like about Axe is you're using it with the code inspector. So you're opening your code inspector and then you're running Axe from there. You're analyzing the page and it's got that code window kind of still open. It'll tell you the type of issues you have and how many there are. Some of the key things about Axe is it'll tell you the severity. So some things are just the best practice and other things are failure of the guideline. And they have these nice learn more links where you can click on that and get way more detail about the issue and how to fix it and why it's a problem.
I think that's also why I like Axe. Sorry, I want to add so much. There's so much to add to. That's also why I like Axe. It's not just a tool that you use to discover like what can be improved, but it's also a learning tool, an awareness tool. Because if you really use Axe and you see all these learn more links, if anybody reads all those links, you're hired, I guess, because there's so much information behind that.
Yeah, like if you, this is why I think it's really important to developers to test, because if they test and they find an issue, you can actually find out how to fix that issue right there. Versus if you just have like a QA tester hand off, here's your Axe report or something like that. What are you going to do with that? It's not really helpful. You have to use the tool and be in the tool. That's where you get all the benefit from. And it's got this nice highlight feature, which will show you where the issue is on screen. So you've got your like code inspector open, and then you can highlight, it'll throw an error here or there, and it'll show you the errors with this particular component. And a lot of times you'll have the same issue repeating over and over. Like it'll tell you you're missing alt text, and they've got these little chevrons, and it'll say like maybe you're missing 10 images have no alt text. And so you've got your highlighter on, and you can just step through them one at a time and see all of the images that have that issue highlighted on the page. And then you can jump using the inspect node link in Axe right to viewing the issue in the source code. So you can see, what's the code before it, what's the code after it, and you've got your Axe window open, and it's just like this all-in-one tool.
Yeah, I think it's really what you say, like it's a bridge between what you see in the browser, like visually happening, and between the actual code. And I think that's really important because sometimes I speak to a developer and I ask them about the code. They're going to show me the code that's basically generating whatever you're seeing. So they're going to show me a piece of React or whatever framework they're using, and not the piece of code that's showing in the browser. And as an accessibility inspector, I don't really care how you build the page. It's what ends up in the browser that's going to create the actual experience, and that's where you use Axe as well. So it's in the right spot.
Yeah, and I don't make any money from promoting Axe or anything. I guess I should throw that out there because it almost sounds like I'm a salesperson for Axe, and I am not. And it's free. At least the browser extension is. There is an X Pro version. I tried it, and it's great. I personally mostly use the free version.
If you do know how to get sponsored, let me know. I think I mention it every week or something because it's just a really useful tool.
Honestly, that would be a great marketing strategy for them to the same way influencers promote whatever on Instagram. You should have people like us promoting your product. Although your product is so good that I guess they're getting this word of mouth promotion for free, right?
Yeah, free promotion is even better. They're smarter than us. Ah, they've got us.
They are. So the last big topic I have is how do you make decisions around accessibility? Because it's often not a black or a white situation, where there's a clear do this or do that. Really, most of the time we live in what's called the gray zone. One of the examples I gave earlier is where do you put the focus in a modal? Do you put it around the home modal, the title, the first focusable element? Some people put it right on the close button. There's no hard and fast answer there. The same thing. This is a problem I struggle with all the time. Technically, when you're coding tabs, so this is like a visual tab interface, like the file tabs where you've got, you click one tab and it shows content. You click another tab, it shows different content. Technically, you're supposed to make it so that the arrow keys navigate through all the tabs, not the tab key, which is, I know, confusing. You don't tab through the tabs, you arrow through the tabs. That's according to the ARIA specifications for doing interactive components. But I find that a bit confusing because I know there are people who use the keyboard who are sighted and they expect to be able to use the tab key. And I see that in user testing. So do you follow the accessibility guideline, or if you're doing a user test and people can't figure out how to use it, do you do what works for the user? So
And
I've got my frame.
there's one thing that makes it even worse for me is that sometimes pages do have tabs or something that looks like tabs, but they're not actually tabs. So there are these tab-like things at the top of the page, and they're just links to other pages. And then you should use tab and not the arrow keys because they look like tabs, but they are not tabs. And that's when you know you're an accessibility person and dive into semantics and are more busy naming things than actually testing them.
Yeah, yeah. And so my framework for making difficult decisions is number one, do user testing. If you can get real people with disabilities to try it out and they can't figure it out, then, fix it. It doesn't really matter what's in the guidelines if people can't figure it out, right? Like your end result is usability for people with disabilities. That's what you're aiming for. So user testing will help you figure out if you've met that goal. The second thing, AT is short for assistive technology testing. So let's say you don't have access to users, your company doesn't have budget yet, or they don't do user testing at all. So you yourself, use the keyboard, use the screen reader, use a magnifier, and figure out if it makes sense to you at the very least. And use that to make your decisions about what you should do. You could do a list of pros and cons. So if I, put the focus here, here are the benefits, here are the negatives. If I put the focus somewhere else, do the same thing, and just, use logic and decision making. Not as good as testing with real people or with real technology, of course. And then this one probably shouldn't be last in the list because it's a great option, but there is an accessibility Slack. And in fact, that's where I found you, Eric, in the Global Accessibility Slack.
Along with many good pieces of advice, yeah.
Yeah. There's tons of people who know a lot about accessibility there. So if you've got a tricky question, ask it. They're going to be happy to help you. So I want to briefly touch on ARIA. Stands for Accessible Rich Internet Application. So it's something that was created to handle all the interactivity that we have in websites nowadays, where websites aren't really like static websites. They're more like web applications. And what ARIA can do is it can be used to explain interactions to screen reader users. and almost everyone gets it wrong at first. I have messed up ARIA so bad. I definitely have. So what I suggest to people who are new is don't try to write your own ARIA. Find an accessible component library and use it. um, I've got some recommendations. Angular material. Now, none of these are perfect, but they've worked accessibility into them. And it's by far better to have something that's been written by someone else and tested by a number of people than something that, if you're brand new to accessibility and you're still learning it, that you're trying to figure it out as you go. It's really tricky. Everything else, I would say give it a go. ARIA, I would say don't. So there's the Angular material library, there's Reach UI for React, and there's Vuify for Vue. There might be some more. With a little bit of digging on anyone's website, you can see whether they've considered accessibility or not. I also have a plain HTML and JavaScript component library in my GitHub repo, and I know, Eric, you have one with your company, right? Lion, I think it's called?
Yeah, we do. We use web components, and the idea is that you can use it in any framework or background that you want to use. And what I always notice with these component libraries, everybody can say that they're accessible. Most of them do, but few of them are. So if you see anything, have a look inside before you actually make a decision.
Yeah, or take it to that Ali Slack, that accessibility Slack. A11Y actually is short form for accessibility because there's 11 characters between the A and the Y, so that's why it's called Ali Slack. So Angular material I've reviewed, and they've done a pretty good job of putting accessibility on. I haven't reviewed the Reach UI for React or the Vuify. I haven't looked at their code, but I did look at their accessibility documentation, and I thought it was quite thorough. So I feel comfortable enough recommending those two, even though I haven't used them. And so to tie it back to this whole idea of falling in love with accessibility, I'm going to talk about some of the things that people say when they're first learning or when they've been told to learn accessibility, and how do we make that a happier way to get started. So people say it's hard, and what I would say to that is just start with the easy stuff. You don't have to become an expert overnight. If you just start with keyboard support, as your first thing, that's how people learn. You don't become an expert until you've done your 10,000 hours of practice, according to Malcolm Gladwell. People say it's boring, so why not use some of the fun technology? I think screen readers are really cool.
When I see somebody on the train and they don't have, they use their phone with the screen turned off and they can still operate it, I'm really impressed. I'm really impressed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really cool. And, having watched so many people use screen readers, now I started watching my videos because the screen reader users, they speed up their audio usually. And I started watching all my YouTube videos at like 1.5 times speed or even 2 times speed. So it's not the same as a screen reader, but it's kind of a similar experience where you're just like, it's going really, really, really fast. And I have the captions on too. So I'm like speed reading. And I think that kind of stuff is awesome.
It's funny, so there's this Dutch COVID app to track who has been infected or not. And they had a user test, and one of the users used the screen reader as well. And the conclusion of the test became, I didn't know people with a screen reader could go through our app faster than people who are sighted. Because they just went so fast. And that was more impressive probably than anything else in the test.
Yeah, I've got a demo of a fellow who does it really, really fast that I'll show shortly. So when people say they don't know how to do something, I say get help. There's the accessibility Slack, lots of answers there. And then there's also Google. Compliance is impossible. I would agree with that, actually. I think full compliance at all times with any kind of big corporation is nearly impossible. So if we stick with usability for people with disabilities, that's a pretty good goal to strive for.
I think it's also really tough because compliance is not the goal often. It's like it's a good thing to measure by, but in the end, you're not doing it to comply.
Yeah. people who don't know ARIA, I say use a component library, and I just told you a couple of them. And then people say, well, I can't do it all. It's too much. There's way too much. So just ask your team to help. Or even if you just did your part. So if you're a developer and you just checked your code or you tested it with the keyboard, something is better than nothing, right? It's better to do a little than it is to do nothing at all when it comes to accessibility. And you just mentioned this. What are our real outcomes? Wow, you beat me to it. You stole my slide here.
So sorry. So sorry.
No, it's okay. It just, I think it validates that this is what, accessibility experts believe, or what we should believe, I think. I wouldn't say that every accessibility expert feels this way, but I think the good ones do. Yeah. The outcome is actually just usability for people with disabilities. And really, that's what all of the legislation around accessibility came from. It came from advocacy from the community of people with disabilities. And they wanted the legislation so that their lives could be easier. Not even easier, just like equivalent to anyone else. They just want equality and the ability to do the same things, like shop online and, look up a menu for a restaurant, that kind of thing, just to be able to live their life. So if whatever you're building enables them to do that, that's the point of all of this. There will be no cat picture or other random things. It's just a straight feed of accessibility news that I find interesting.
So what do you do with your cat then?
My cat's on Instagram.
Right.
Of course. Yeah. And then my GitHub repo, where I have learning resources, I have testing tools, linked to the tools, how to use them, that kind of stuff. And I also have a repository called Test ARIA, which is where I have my plain JavaScript and HTML ARIA library and some documentation. And all of that is like modified from code other accessibility experts have written, and I simplified it and put it all in one place and made it all plain vanilla JavaScript, which I find really helpful for learning, because you got stuff in React and Angular and every other, framework. And I thought, I'm just going to make something that even the most beginner developer should be able to understand, because I'm not the most expert developer myself. So that's it.
Yeah, and for everybody that doesn't know, Kate has a lot of information on her GitHub. So if you ever look for resources, it's a good starting point.
Yeah, and you have a page that you just created, which I thought was really awesome, which is very similar to what I'm doing with this talk, which is, simple things to get people started, which, congratulations, I think that's great.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it might be some of the hardest things that we can do to bring back all the information and all the specifications that we know, and to make it smaller. I mean, if there's one thing that people with accessibility knowledge can do, it's write books, like write long pieces of text. But to bring it back to something small, that's a big challenge.
Yeah, and I hope I managed to accomplish that through this talk, to try to simplify things and give people a few things to focus on, just to get started, so that it's not so overwhelming, and that you go into it with the right mindset, that this is all about people and helping people. And, the guidelines are a great reference, but it's not your best teaching tool. If you're just learning, start using the technology. And you, assuming you're a developer because you love technology, it's going to be so much more fun to get into accessibility if you take it at that technology angle, right?
Yeah, and what you said also, try to have everybody contribute a little bit is much more interesting than having nothing at all, of course. So even little bits can help.
Mm-hmm.
And
are there questions coming through, or?
Yeah, do we have any questions on the stream? I don't know. I feel like I've interrupted you constantly, but you've also shared a lot of information, and I want to react on everything, so I even held back a bit. It's a lot to digest, even for an introduction. There's a lot of information there, so I hope it's going to help some people. I'm not sure if we have any questions. I don't think we have any, but
people can rewatch it.
Yeah, exactly. We're gonna have this recording online, and people can find you at all these links. And if they have any questions, they can stalk you basically till eternity.
Yeah.
So be ready.
Yeah, always. I'm happy to take
Okay.
questions.
So I get it's a really nice talk. So that's not a question, but really nice to hear as well. I'm gonna stop the stream at this point. I want to thank everybody for listening and watching, and if you're watching back, also thank you very much. I won't be here for the next 2 weeks. That's also important for those people that do come back each time. I'm on a vacation, so I'll be gone for 2 weeks, and then in September I hope to have 2 guests again. But that's it for the stream for tonight. Thank you very much, and see you next time.